You hear it all the time. Why doesn't anybody want to work anymore? This claim that a lot of people are checking out of the workforce to varying degrees. In part, this is just something that happens depending on how the job market is going. When the economy is good, people have options. When it isn't, they take what they can get. But underlying this are data that support the claim that people aren't really that happy about going to work.
I just stare at my desk, but it looks like I'm working. I do that for probably another hour after lunch too. I'd say in a given week, I probably only do about 15 minutes of real, actual work.
It varies from country to country, but globally, engagement is down, turnover is up, and burnout is more and more common. I'm Mike. I've got 25 years background in business from pharma tech and consulting. I've held C-level roles in international companies. I have degrees in business, human resources, and psychology. On this channel, I cover business and careers. I analyze and pick apart why companies do the things they do. And I provide advice on careers and navigating the corporate world. Today, we're talking about why it feels like people don't want to work anymore and why. Let's get stuck in. There are two ways you can start looking at the question of whether people want to work anymore. The first one is looking at labor force participation rates, unemployment, stuff like that. But these data are looking at it from a macroeconomic lens about how we are getting older as a workforce, and that's interesting, and you can't ignore the macro perspective. But it's more the work experience that I'm curious about. Every year, the research firm Gallup do a global report looking at employee engagement. And engagement is down. It was at its lowest in 2009, right after the 2008 financial crash. Since then, it's gone up with a dip around COVID, but there are some key things in particular that are worth taking note of. Globally, less than 20% of regular employees feel they are engaged in their work. Managers have had declining engagement for a couple of years, and overall, that number is just low. At best, 1 in 4 employees reported that they are engaged in their workplace. 2 in 4 kind of just show up for work, and 1 in 4 are actively disengaged. 17% globally just don't want to be at the company they're working at. 58% globally feel they're struggling. 40% experience high stress on a daily basis. 21% experience anger, and 23% experience sadness. 50% are looking for another job, and about the same number feel it's really hard to find another job. The US, as one of the better countries, has a third of every employee engaged, where it's a little bit more than 1 in 10 in Europe that are actively engaged. Not unsurprisingly, the experience of struggling is the one factor that varies the most from region to region, where people in sub-Saharan Africa, the most of all, feel they are struggling. But again, even in the US and in Europe, almost half of all employees feel they're struggling. And in the happiest countries in the world, those in the Nordics, employees state that they are thriving with scores of over 70%. They experience less stress, less anger, less sadness than most countries. But their engagement still barely creeps up over 20%. So right off the bat, it's not so much that people don't want to work anymore, but more about the way people are doing their jobs. Not a lot of people seem engaged or willing to go the extra mile. Why? What's going on? Part of this has nothing to do with any one specific company. It is about macroeconomic factors. Post-COVID, with high inflation, increasing economic pessimism, it directly impacts individual engagement. When times are good, companies do well, they grow, they raise salaries, and they share more or less, at least in the spoils, and people engage more. The Gallup report looks at 2024 and back. But based on the first 6 months of 2025, which is dominated by trade wars, escalating regional conflicts, the threat of AI pessimism, all of that kind of stuff creeping in, it's going to have an effect on engagement. 2009 was a record low historically for engagement, and it wasn't a big surprise that it was right after the 2008 global economic collapse. If you're new here and have stuck around so far in the video, then you must be enjoying it. If so, I'm trying to grow this channel as much as possible. That needs a community. If you want to be part of that community, please do consider clicking the subscribe button. Thanks a ton. Pay disparity is also a reason. The ratio of salary between a CEO and an employee in the US easily goes above 100, according to Forbes magazine. In Northern Europe, it's over 60. As equity has increased as a proportion of top executives' compensation, their pay relative to the regular employee has skyrocketed. Labor costs in the EU region increased by about 4.5% in 2024, but coming off of an incredibly high inflation, purchasing power just hasn't returned to previous levels. Salaries are lagging in this regard. US salaries went up by about 3.4% at a time in 2024 where the stock market grew by 23%. Income disparity between the highest earners and the lowest earners has continued to grow, and employees are indicating consistently in surveys that they don't feel they are getting a fair share of the positive performance of companies. There was a guy called Hertzberg back in the 20th century who said salary was a hygiene factor. I think we, for some people, are at the point where they don't feel the hygiene is there. Job security was never a given, but the fact is today you're going to have more jobs throughout your lifetime than any generation before you. According to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, a person aged 55 will on average have about 12 jobs throughout their lifetime. A 25-year-old today is expected to have between 14 and 16 jobs, and they're also expected to have more periods of longer and shorter unemployment.
David, Intel, with its research and development hub in Hillsboro, is laying off workers yet again.
We got some breaking news just before you stepped onto set. This coming from Microsoft that basically they're going to cut 9,000 workers in a second wave of major layoffs. It seems like.
Well, BP's announced it's cutting thousands of jobs as part of a major cost-saving drive.
Oil giant Chevron says it's cutting its global workforce by 15 to 20% next year.
Amazon is delayering middle management. Intel is cutting costs. IBM is cutting costs. Companies on average are being perceived to fairly consistently communicate that their loyalty is only to the shareholders. The loyalty towards the employee goes only as far as there is a business need, which to an extent, I suppose, is as it should be. But it wasn't always that way. Up to the late 1960s, employers in the US saw it far more as their social responsibility to weather the storm together with employees when times were tough, and not just cut people at the first sign of a challenge. I'd argue that it's not surprising that a loyalty that's performance contingent will be met with a corresponding lower loyalty from the employees, on the other hand. Simply put, I'm not as likely to put my heart into something if I know you'll cut me at the first sign of underperformance of the business. Amazon wants fewer managers. Intel is delayering. Promotion in larger organizations feels to be in decline to some extent. Promotion as an incentive to engage in your work is declining. Data's clear on that. Also, AI is reducing the need for certain types of roles. In the last 20 years, we've seen a huge shift also towards less hierarchical organizational structures across the West, with a corresponding reduction in promotion opportunities. Less layers, wider span of control greatly reduce the opportunities. In specific sectors like tech, where the industry is past the stage of hyperscaling and rapid growth, promotion as a consequence of organic growth is also becoming rarer. Engagement is in part driven by opportunity, and with decreased opportunity, that engagement is going to be put under pressure. Here's how burnout has become at work. 50% of all surveyed Americans experience regular stress, according to Gallup. Although the number is lower in the EU, it's still 38%. SHRM reports that 44% of American staff feel burned out from their job. Sergey Brin of Gemini and formerly Google stated at one point that 60 hours of work is the sweet spot. The chairman and managing director of Larsen & Toubro stated at one point that his ideal was a 90-hour work week and advocated for massive increases in working hours in India. Korea, as a country, has one of the longest working hours in the world, and their staff, well, if not literally, then figuratively dropping like flies. Together with Japan, South Korea is repeatedly brought up in the media as the model of a society defined by pressure and overwork. Microsoft studied data from the users of their software, and it shows that 40% of global staff check email before 6 a.m. and evening meetings are up by 16%. All of which, according to Microsoft, was decreasing productivity overall. All this, and the reality is that any actual real research data indicates that most people decrease in productivity above 50 hours per week. When newer generations are asked in the West and Asia and everywhere else, few want to work much more than 40 hours per week. Even Koreans, when asked, indicate a desire to work far less than the current Korean norms. Working hours are going to be variable from country to country. Cultural and societal norms and how they are accepted regarding working hours differ wildly, but the commonality from Denmark to Japan to Canada is that people want to work less, and a lot of them feel overworked. Whether it's burnout or a feeling of being exploited, any perceived imbalance is going to translate for a lot of people, if not into disengagement, then at least to indifference. It's this quiet quitting phenomenon of going to work and doing exactly what it says in your job description and nothing more. Research from Stanford University tends to show that companies that allow a greater degree of remote or hybrid work have higher engagement. Specifically, it's the people with remote and hybrid options whose engagement increases. This phenomenon isn't complicated to understand. A lot of modern employees, especially the younger generations, tend to value flexibility as a component of employment highly. This applies to locations of working arrangements, but also flexibility about vacations, options to take sabbaticals, and relocations for periods of time. The author Daniel Pink popularized the concept of purpose, autonomy, and mastery as drivers of motivation and engagement a couple of years back. Autonomy was also defined not just in terms of how you do your work, but when and where. And this is also generally associated with increased engagement. The Gallup report also shone a light on the fact that it's in particular middle managers' engagement that has dropped the most. Middle management has actually never been that easy. These people are literally the ones that are in the rock and the hard place. Above them, you have executive management. Below them, you have employees. They are responsible for driving and executing on company strategies and priorities, while they also have to tend to employee concerns and criticisms. The reasons for management engagement decline is down to lack of training, lack of support, and excessive expectations, according to the Gallup report. And Gallup point to the risk that management engagement directly affects team engagement. In all my years in multiple companies, I've seen benchmark after benchmark survey. And it seems to me like a law of nature that the highest engagement is always correlated to how close you are to the top, and it declines from there. The further you are from the top, the lower your engagement is usually going to be. With delayed organizations, increased span of control, and greater expectations towards the individual managers, this is going to amplify the risk of burnout, overwork, and the sense of lack of autonomy.
Apparently, millennials as a generation, which is a group of people who were born approximately 1984 and after, are tough to manage. And they're accused of being entitled and narcissistic and self-interested, unfocused, lazy. But entitled is the big one.
Generationally, something else is also occurring. No matter how you interpret how the respondents think of the concept of success, what we're seeing is a level of expectation that is often quite distant from the realities of corporate employment. Gen Z and the emerging Gen Alpha are amongst the most prone also to anxiety of all generations. The research does seem to show that on the surface they are highly change open when it comes to learning and development and adoption of technology. These generations are also the ones that research finds display higher degrees of feelings of inadequacy than any previous generations. Data suggests greater degrees of conflict avoidance. They have bigger expectations to have highly supportive workplaces and working environments, and companies are typically not equipped to provide that support, which again drives disengagement. Organizations that have sink or swim or up or out cultures are not built to cope with some of the traits and behaviors displayed by large parts of these younger generations. These generations also indicate a higher demand for frequent validation and feedback. Leveling up is so important to a lot of them, and a sense of constant progression is something they respond to. When you've got companies that are promoting less and less and generally still have some level of tenure-based promotion, Gen Zs are likely to disengage much faster and are more likely to check out entirely if they have the opportunity. In a report from Oak Engage in the UK, 63% of respondents said they had at some point resigned because of workplace culture issues. This ranged from too high workloads relative to expectations to fully toxic environments where people had been exposed to harassment or other factors affecting mental health. Now, I don't necessarily think you can assume that all workplaces are toxic, but from the 51% globally that feel stressed, according to Gallup, and the 61% in the other report potentially leaving because of cultural issues, it should be reasonable to say that there's at least some toxicity element out there that's affecting people's well-being and that is hammering engagement. These new generations also have other commonalities that shine through in research. Inclusion, social responsibility, environmental responsibility, these things are important to them. Companies have also moved for all sorts of reasons to include these concerns in their priorities, ESG, all that kind of stuff. Ernst & Young, though, published a report indicating that while companies are exceptionally good at talking a good game, the real changes and meaningful actions were more scarce. This leads to a disillusionment with organizations that go through performative motions, but when push comes to shove, they choose the course that optimizes for shareholder value only. Companies' purposes end up coming across as disingenuous, and employees are again at the risk of disengaging. Looking at more generational research, we see a larger proportion of people looking for more balanced lives. People want to work, but they also want to be good parents and they want to self-actualize. Now, I think people always wanted to be good parents, but what has changed over the last 3 to 4 decades is what it takes in terms of time and investment to be seen as a good parent. In my dad's day, a good father was a man who put food on the table. Today, a good dad does that, but he also has a much more active role in the life of the children. With 24 hours available, for most people, something's got to give. Engaging entirely in your job does to some extent mean having less engagement available for other things. I actually spoke to an old colleague at a high-tier consulting firm the other day, and he shared an anecdote with me, and it shocked me. It was a strategy consulting firm where he, as a senior partner, stated, "I have to ask someone if they want to work over the weekend." And the point is, it wasn't a given that he could find someone that would be willing. That conversation would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. Priorities for people have changed. Even the highest tier of management consulting firms are having to adapt. Looking at the Gallup report, we can take comfort at least in the best practice companies which easily achieve engagement scores of 60 and 70 and above. They have significant and majorities of employees that are engaged and really want to be there. But that's the high end, the best companies. The average, on the other hand, the mean, is far lower, and the bottom end is even lower than that. The fact that engagement has been increasing since 2009, right after the 2008 financial crisis, isn't really a starting point to be proud of. 23% engagement is meager at best, so there is a problem. And there isn't one thing that is affecting engagement across the globe. But I do think there are some overlaps in all of these symptoms that I've described. For me, the commonality in all of these things is imbalance. There was this concept that was popular a couple of years back, and it was the concept of the psychological contract between the employer and the employee. It was about more than what was stated in the legal employment contract. There was an assumed implicit understanding of what you get when you do A or B. So McKinsey consultants get driven hard and put in ridiculous hours, but they get a big paycheck, but they also get a brand name that guarantees them future employment, and nobody's going to bat an eye at how much you expense at the hotel bar. It's not just about the salary. There's a balance to the relationship overall, where across the West, and likely more so in the US, but not limited to the US, there's a growing feeling of imbalance. What you're putting in is not being reciprocated with what is coming out. And honestly, we're at risk in some industries and in some types of work of driving even more imbalance. As a business leader, I see how that lack of engagement, how that quiet quitting negatively affects company performance. That imbalance is also affecting the companies. And it doesn't have to be that way. I'm not advocating for some communist redistribution of resources, but I do feel a recalibration of the balance of what is offered from employers versus what is expected is both possible, reasonable, and more sustainable over time. I've got my own pet aversion to short-sighted leadership with a focus on short-term stock gains. Addressing these imbalances at multiple levels, I think, would be advantageous for employers in the long term. It'll create more sustainable business and just generally make going to work something that more than only 23% actively engage in. Those were my thoughts. Share your thoughts in the comments. And of course, remember always to subscribe. See you soon.